Okay, I'm just taking a few minutes right now, making sure that we are live on YouTube before I give the introduction, or if you'd like to give it as well, Irene, um,
Go ahead,
please
Roxana.
do.
Go ahead.
Okay, okay, you got it. Okay, we are live on YouTube. Just taking. Okay, perfect. All righties. I'd like to welcome everybody to T-Space Architecture series. Thank you for joining us today for Niall Hobhouse lecture. This is the first lecture of the series organized by T-Space within the framework of the Architecture Residency Program. I am Roxana Colocho, and I am this year's residency host. For our new audience, I will introduce T-Space and its programming. T-Space is a nonprofit organization, an initiative of the Stephen Myron Hall Foundation in Rhinebeck, New York. It focuses on art, education, design, and ecology. In addition to the architecture residency program, T-Space organizes the Synthesis of the Arts events, which supports the coming together of the arts, art, architecture exhibition, poetry readings, music performances. They all take place here on the grounds in Rhinebeck. This lecture today is part of the Architecture Residency, an intensive 25-day program that takes place every July. It's in its ninth year, and the theme of this residency is sublimity. Young professionals and students from the fields of art and architecture joining us to experiment with design and critical thinking. I'd like to welcome our panelists and residents who are joining us here from all parts of the world: Abdullah, Alex, Claire, Miranda, and Shrey. We are very happy to have you in the program this year. I'd like to acknowledge the supporters of the program. This year, our cohort is awarded with a travel stipend to visit us here in Rhinebeck upon the completion of the program. This is only possible thanks to the very generous supporters of several institutions and individuals. We are very grateful for your support. The structure of the webinar is a presentation by Niall of approximately 35 to 45 minutes, and then we will leave it open for a 15-minute Q&A. If you have any questions while Niall is giving his presentation, feel free to write them in the chat throughout the course of the lecture or at the very end. I will leave it now to Shrey to introduce Niall.
Thank you, Roxana. Niall Hobhouse is an art collector, curator, and writer who has been collecting drawings by architects for over 30 years. He curates exhibitions and writes about buildings, landscape, and museums. He is the chair of the Drawing Matter Trust, which he established to explore the role of drawing within architecture, architectural memory, and exhibitions. Through his work with Drawing Matter, he has amassed a significant collection of items ranging from the Renaissance to the 21st century, including sketches, models, collages, photographs, and publications. This collection reflects Hobhouse's deep commitment to exploring the creative and documentary power of architectural drawings. It has become a vital resource for researchers, students, and exhibitions. Beyond his role as a collector, Hobhouse is an active curator and advisor. He has curated several exhibitions, drawing mainly on his own collections and exploring a wide range of architectural subjects at esteemed venues such as the Swiss Architecture Museum, Hauser and Wirth Somerset, and the Courtauld Institute of Art in London. He has been a governor of the London School of Economics, a trustee of the Sir John Soanes Museum, and of the Canadian Centre for Architecture, Montreal. His multifaceted career underscores a singular devotion to architecture, not merely as built work, but as creative process, pedagogy, and cultural legacy. Welcome, Niall.
Oh, thank you, Shrey. Can you all see me? That was a longer and more flattering introduction than I deserved, but I appreciate it. And I would only say that the collection gets all the attention, and I would much prefer the world focused more on the programming that we've developed around the collection. That is, we see the drawings as essentially a prop for publications, for workshops, for events. It's a nuanced change, but it's something that is actually important to me. Um, uh, I think that it's probably worth saying that our principal tool is conducting in-person workshops in our space in London, where we bring together either teaching studios or practice studios around particular problems. That's always the format of a workshop, where we try and formulate with the tutor or with the practice principal what it is that they're particularly interested in exploring, um, and um, and we actually see every workshop as a kind of challenge to the collection, and we take what we learn from that experience of selecting material as a guide to indicating to us what we should acquire next. So it's actually a very reflexive and circular process. Um, what I thought I would do today is uh, try and replicate as closely as possible the format of a regular workshop. Although we can't be there together, I will. I'll show you a lot of drawings, um, and it's worth saying that, um, and I think this is important. I'm showing them to you as representative, not so much because they're by Frank Lloyd Wright, but because they represent a particular historical and cultural moment. So actually, the crucial information about the drawings is as much as anything the date at which they were done, rather than the authorship. Um, um, and the other thing, also worth saying, perhaps, is that most of what I'm going to show you, most of the individual drawings that I show you are part of larger sets. We Our collecting principle is, where we can, is to take all the drawings for a particular project. So in the case, for instance, of Alvaro Siza, we have 2 or 3 thousand drawings for a single social housing project in Portugal during the revolution. And if you're interested by that, the whole of the collection catalogue is online. So if you see something that interests you that you want to explore, it's a very simple process to go to the Drawing Matters site and go from there. Um, I'm going to move to share screen at this point. Oh, that's not what I expected. There we go. Um, the reason that I'm not currently in the archive is because we actually have a workshop going on there this afternoon. And this gives you a general idea of how a workshop works. We probably begin with 10 or 15 drawings on the table, selected either by the principal or by individual. This is a workshop with a landscape design practice called headed by Tom Stewart Smith. Uh, we start with 10 or 15 drawings on the table, and we judge the success of a workshop by how many drawings we end up with on the table, sometimes 100. And actually, I use this image because it was also a workshop about landscape. You can see a drawing by Charles Jenks there in the foreground.
Niall, sorry to interrupt. Does everybody see the screen? Are you screen sharing, Niall, right now?
I am screen sharing now.
I cannot see the screen. Is it just me?
I apologize, everybody. for some reason, I'm not getting the share option is not coming out of the.
Do you want us to share on your behalf, Niall?
Yeah.
Or no,
Why
there
don't
is
you
no
share
rush.
on my behalf, Roxanne? I'm so sorry. There's some technical glitch
No,
at this end.
No problem.
no rush.
Are you are you succeeding, Roxanne?
Not yet. One moment. It is loading right
For some
now.
reason, I'm now stuck in the
Oh
PowerPoint
no.
program, and I think I will have to clock out and then clock back.
Okay, no worries. Let's see. More share. Okay.
It's
Is every
starting now. Yes, it's loading. And I think Niall is trying to reconnect.
okay.
This is the first slide, right?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. Let's give him a moment.
There.
Okay. Here we go. Niall, would you like to try to share again? And if it doesn't work, I will share the screen.
I would prefer, I think, you to go because I don't want to go
You
round the
got it.
same hoops again. So if you're happy,
No
Roxana, let's
worries.
do that.
Of course. Let
Um,
me do that now. Okay, is everybody able to see my screen?
It's loading now. Perfect. Now we can, if you can go full screen. Perfect. It's
fantastic.
beautiful
So
image.
yeah, I can see it at all events. Um, so I think, I mean, I've on this question of landscape, I wanted to make the only brief ideological point that I have for you today, um, which is that I've always seen architecture as very much a subset of a much broader field of spatial design that includes everything. That includes urbanism, arranging the furniture, gardening, landscape design. And I've always felt that architects, particularly architects, struggle to within this system. I mean, the training of architecture is so much about asserting a box in a way that makes it visually a kind of primary focus. And looking at landscape and looking particularly at landscape drawings raises a particular set of problems, both of kind of conception and in the context of this talk, of representation. Let's have the next slide. On representation, there's always a sense that the conventions of drawing and the cultural context in which, or the conventions of drawing and the cultural context in which a drawing was produced, shapes the actual process of design. And it's this that I want to explore today. And as I say, I'm going to rather bombard you with images. Here are two that, in a sense, I think bracket the thing we're going to discuss. On the left is a drawing by Dumont, where he has taken a plan of St. Peter's in Rome, which he developed early in his career, and transformed it into the garden of a monastery. On the right, a drawing by Charles Dulac, who's a symbolist of the late 19th century, where he is, this is preliminary for a print, and he's reimagining the forest of Fontainebleau as a Gothic cathedral. So on the one hand, we have an architect imagining a landscape garden, or taking a building and turning it into a landscape garden. On the other, we have an artist taking a genuine bit of landscape and transforming it into a building. Let's have the next one. This is another way of setting the scene. On the left, well, no, let's start with the Sangala drawing at the top, which was developed as an illustration to Vitruvius's sixth book, and drawn during the 1540s or early 1550s, and it shows the Greek philosopher Aristippus having been shipwrecked in the Aegean, discovering what is described as the footprint of a building in the soft ground. The important distinction here is that the Renaissance conception of a building plan was developed from the idea of a footprint. And it's very, very different from the kind of horizontal section that we see as becoming a standard trope of architectural drawing within 50 or 60 years. But this ambiguity about whether the building belongs in the landscape or is imposed on it is sort of implicit in this drawing. On the left, it's the original drawing for the frontispiece of Logier's great book on the origins of architecture, on the theory of the primitive hut, and again addresses this question of the relationship of architecture to landscape. And then at the bottom, a drawing by Gordon Matter Clark from the early 1970s that explores exactly the same set of theoretical questions. And what I'm trying to do here is stress the interrelation of architecture and landscape. Can we have the next slide? I'm going to show you a few examples, with some irony, it has to be said, of attempts by architects to achieve if you like, the sublime. This is a particular favorite of mine, which is by Depre working for the King of Sweden, flattering the King of Sweden by presenting him with a drawing of the founding of Alexandria. You can see Alexander to the left there with a plumed helmet, and in front of him you can see the architect presenting the drawings of the town, which, although it appears in the drawing, is not yet built. It says a lot about the ambition of architects to transform the world. Next, please. This is drawing more or less the same date and gets us closer to the heart of what I want to talk about. It's in a way, perfect depiction of the sublime by actually an engineer, not an architect, called Leveille, and shows a group of students drawing a ruined Gothic church in the north of France. But again, I see it as representative of a certain sensibility. Next, please. Here we have Fontaine, the great French architect, producing a theoretical scheme for a cemetery. This is again around 1800, and Depre again, who we saw in the 2 slides ago. This is an extraordinary project in which he is reimagining. The Knights of Malta have just been excluded from Malta by the Napoleonic Wars, and there was a plan to relocate them to a Caribbean island. And here he has drawn the whole history of architecture on a single sheet as a incentive, whether to Gustavus or to the knights themselves. It's very unclear. Next, please. This is this is Fontaine again, a drawing that he sent back from Rome to the French Academy in 1792, and is a very careful attempt to reimagine the villa of Pliny the Elder, which sat in Posillipo under the volcano and was destroyed with Pompeii. So here we're and this is something that everybody would have known and understood, the imminence of its destruction. Next, please. Here, in a way, is a more prosaic scheme on the left by Le Corbusier, where the principal project of the principal infrastructure project of the Indian government in the 1950s was the creation of a series of dams on the rivers in the foothills of the Himalayas. And he was asked by President Nehru for a proposal to in a way transform the dam into a piece of land art. It's a scheme that inevitably wasn't ever built. It's on a huge sheet of vellum, which is presented very, very carefully as though it's an informal sketch tossed off by Corbusier, but in fact was used as the actual presentation sheet to the president. On the left, an image I'm sure you all know very well, which is Mrs. Glass Skyscraper from 1922, where he is deliberately playing with the contrast between the gleaming glass tower that is imagined as largely transparent and the 18th and 19th century houses in Berlin surrounding it at the base. He actually used the set designers from the Berlin film studios and from Nosferatu particularly to model in clay the Williamine houses. I mean, this is by way of saying that representation is never innocent, and always needs to be understood in the context of what it was intended to be for. Next, please. Here we come into the post-war period, but still with this whiff of what might be called the sublime. On the left is a collage by Alison and Peter Smithson for their competition entry for Golden Lane, which was a bombed site in central London. And what they have used here very provocatively is that the collage of the proposed building has been superimposed onto a photograph of Coventry, which is a town in the Midlands in England, which was bombed to destruction in 1944. And this is a Ministry of Defence photograph taken 2 weeks after the bombing. But again, there's a rhetoric here, as indeed there is on the right-hand side, which is part of one sheet from Rem Koolhaas's graduation project from the AA in 1973, which refers, I think, very directly to the Superstudio continuous monument, and was a reimagining of a quite small area of central London on the assumption that there was a kind of wasteland everywhere beyond it. Next, please. Here we are with Superstudio. The image on the left is part of the continuous monument project, where the monument travels around the world, visiting important buildings and important landscapes, Niagara Falls, the Taj Mahal, and so on, and arrives in New York. The image on the left comes at the very end of the continuous monument sequence. So in late 1972, where the monument has traveled around the world from Florence, it returns to Florence to find that it's, in a sense, done its job, and that the city has been superannuated. Everybody is now living within the monument. And it has nothing to do, there's nothing left for it to do but to join itself a little sadly to the Ponte Vecchio in Florence. It's called Florence as a Field of Wheat, and represents a sort of high point of radical Florentine thinking from that period. Next. And I think we're pretty near the end of this section. Super Studio again. This is uh, uh, the meteor crater in Arizona, developed as a drawing and ultimately as a print for a show at the Rhode Island School of Design in the early 1970s. And on the right is by the American artist Robert Smithson, uh, from a very early set of drawings in which he imagines the landscape and his own house um, uh, as something that's emerged really from his unconscious. Next, please. I thought it it was important to see this theme of the sublime as something which emerges from the picturesque movement. It's impossible in my mind to separate the two. The one leads firmly to the other. And I think that I think what's important here is to understand the picturesque as the way that, because the picturesque is a conception of landscape which is derived from two-dimensional representations of it. So it, as you probably all know, descends from paintings by Claude Lorraine and Nicolas Poussin in the 16th century, and then develops as a very specifically in England through the 18th century. I think, again, it's important to understand that, I mean, I have many, many problems with the picturesque, and I'm not a fan of it, but I think to give it its cultural context, it's very important to understand that that it developed in England specifically in response to the problem of space. That is, we are a relatively small, a very small country, which even in the 18th century was very heavily populated. And the principal, how should I say, the principal objective of the picturesque is to make limited space go further or seem to go further. This is a kind of extreme example by Verdoyer, a wonderful French architect, the older Verdoyer, for a kind of folly in the landscape. What is fascinating, and I hope makes my point, is that on the right you can see the plan of the site on which it was to sit. It turns out to be the back garden of his own house outside Paris, and you can see how limited his site was. It's almost certain that the artificial mountain was blocking out a view of other houses to the left. Next, please. And here, somewhat the same. This is Frank Lloyd Wright for the Arch Oboler House in California. Interesting for me because it's the early stages of a presentation drawing for the client, which then was rejected by Wright, and I think very clearly the reason that it wasn't presented to the client was because it's actually impossible. You see the sea to the left. It's actually impossible to see the sea from this particular viewpoint. I know this because I've been to the Malibu Canyons and stood exactly where the draftsman was imagining that they were standing. But again, so much representation is about uh, 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 the distortion, if you like, of space. Next, please. And here, rather on the same theme, is the Edgar Ewing house by John Lautner, uh, uh, um, very much conceived as a dramatic addition to the landscape. And on the right, a scheme by Bruce Goff for a house for two artists and their adjoining studios. So the studios are actually in the projecting tubes. This was in West Texas in, the Lautner house is probably 52. The Goff project is 56. And if we go to the next slide, you will see that Lautner's problem was how to actually place a circular house in a very, very extreme hillside landscape. And the site plan is below, on a site which was in fact fantastically small for the project. The Bruce Goff plan makes no accommodation of the quite tricky landscape in which it was going to sit. Next, please. So now a little bit of drawing history. On the left is a plan is a presentation sheet for the drawings of for the landscape, or part of the landscape at Marly, which is outside Paris and belonged to the French royal family. It's, as far as we can judge it, from the history of the project, around 1730. So more or less the same date as the drawing by William Kent on the right, which shows a parkland landscape in England and a proposal for minimal picturesque interventions. I paired these two because I like the fact that they were more or less contemporary with each other, and I thought we should be sympathetic to the French draftsman, who was very constrained by the conventions, the drawing conventions that he had to observe, and no doubt by complicated contractual arrangements in terms of what was presented to the king at a particular point. The interesting thing about the Kent drawing is that we know that it was a presentation drawing. So that's all the client got. And Kent, as you see, hardly bothers to sketch the details of these very transient things, the trees and the foliage. And let's go to the next one. So, and this is Kent again. So Kent, is worth saying, I see very much as the father of the English picturesque movement. He returned from the continent, particularly from Italy, with a great bundle of drawings by Andrea Palladio and a series of new and very radical ideas about how landscapes should be designed. Something to remember here is that the first iterations of the picturesque landscape were actually all on sites very close to London, where space was most constrained. And what he's done here is show us the view of a house that he was designing for a rich client in Wimbledon, which is a suburb of London, where he has co-opted the house next door as a kind of folly within the landscape. So it's cynical piece of appropriation of what is in a way somebody else's land. And what I've always liked almost best about the drawing was the notes that you see on the left, which are actually written on the back of the drawing before he sent it to the client, which seems to be a calculation of the rent that the client would lose by converting the area in front of the agricultural rent that the client would lose by converting the area in front of the house and down into the bottom of the valley into an ideal landscape of this kind. It's one of the really fascinating things that one finds about in all of these discussions about the English 18th century landscape is that it's enmeshed with commercial considerations. For instance, that the move to remove formal gardens in front of the houses of these great 17th century gardens that existed really all over England was partly driven by the introduction of toll roads and coaches, which meant that a household on that scale needed huge stables and lots of grazing ground for horses and for haymaking within the immediate precinct of the house. Next, please. This is another playful contrast. On the right at the top is Capability Brown, who was responsible for landscaping literally hundreds of these parks around the south of England. He's not a very good architect, but every now and then he proposes a building to a client. And as you see here, and this is again a presentation drawing, folded to be posted to the client. As you see here, the representation of the landscape is entirely schematic. On the left, you have a very good architect, Belanger, in the 1780s, developing a plan for a landscape park, actually it's extremely misleading, the drawing, developed for so a landscape park in central Paris, where in fact he's devoted more energy to drawing trees that don't exist and could never exist than he has to developing the architecture. I mean, these are two examples of, in a way, architects defeated by the problem of representing landscape. On you go. Sorry, Roxana. Next, please. I think it's important to discuss a historical turn at the end of the 18th century, the moment where the preoccupation with the picturesque coincides or is replaced actually by an interest in the sublime. And that is marked very remarkably by a turn towards drawing nature sur place, drawing nature, going out into the landscape and recording things directly. And it happens first amongst painters, and then very, very quickly, the architects begin to absorb it and sort of imitate it. I mean, these are three. The one on the left is by Gilpin, who was an English landscape theorist, and the other two are French artists in Paris at the very end of the 18th century. This is a view, as you can see, of the Palatine. Next, please. And the other the parallel move with this was towards traveling sketchbooks, and from the 1790s, every architect, particularly those traveling abroad or away from home or to Rome, traveled with sketchbooks. I mean, these are three examples. The drawing at the top is by Hippolyte Lebar. As he sets out for Rome at the beginning of the 18th century, the two below are actually from the same sketchbook by Viollet-le-Duc. One is a view of Avignon sketched from across the river, and the other is a view of Carcassonne near Toulouse, which 20 years later he transforms as a kind of sublime folly. But I mean, these sketchbooks are it's worth saying, are a tiny fraction of the production. We probably have 150 sketchbooks of Rome, and any other architectural collection will have these examples. Next, please. Here is another strategy which comes out of drawing directly from nature. So this is 80 or 90 years later that the William Kent drawing that we were just looking at. I think it's about 1815, and again shows the view from the front of a country house by, in this case, by Humphrey Repton, the great early 19th century landscape designer. So it's designed as a panorama. You're imagined to be sitting in the drawing room of a newly built country house. You would see a chair on the right and two sort of token cows in the field and some deer. And this was a standard presentation format for the Reptons. It's a drawing which is about 5 feet long, something like that. But at all events gives you an idea of another trend in landscape representation. Next, please. This just as a sort of survey of the representation of landscape. These are 3 images from a wonderful sequence of model photographs developed by Mies van der Rohe for the Weissenhof-Seidlin project in 1925. Why they're particularly interesting is that we know there were in these photographs, which were very carefully staged. We know that the photography was circulated between all the architects who participated in the Wiesenhof project, of which Mies was the master planner. So the photographs become part of the design process. Unfortunately, the plaster models are long lost, but this is the best record that we have. Next, please. This I put it slightly facetiously on the right. Well, let's start on the left. Corbusier again, another dam, struggling to convey the information that he needs to convey to the office in Chandigarh. And I think what one has to recognize is that the normal conventions of architectural drawing begin very quickly break down when confronted with the realities of landscape. And on the right, you see Louis Kahn working on the landscape working on the landscape for a urban intervention in Kansas City, very much towards the end of his life. And this was a drawing that he actually developed with the client in the room. So it was a discursive drawing. I actually enjoy it because it's almost impossible to understand, and one sees him in a way struggling with the issues of representation. Uh, and in a certain way, I like drawings that are honourable failures, and I think this one falls hopefully into that category. On again, please. I'm sort of towards the end. I'm just going to show you work by, or specifically responses by 3 or 4 wonderful architects to landscape propositions. And we'll go through them very quickly, but it will give you an idea of the kind of flexibility of approach that we see in work in the 1960s and 70s and 80s. So this is Hans Hollein, the German architect, actually on a scholarship to America in 1962. And here he is at Second Messe, drawing what is essentially a topographical record of the building. Can we go then to the next slide? So, and here you see what the incredibly elaborate and obsessive projects that imaginary projects that Hollein develops from this experience of looking at these early American Indian sites. The schemes get more and more intense and madder as you go along, but this gives you a flavor of, or a sense of, how he was triggered by the Second Messe site. Next, please. So this is a Italian architect called Alberto Ponis, who died only last year, and made a enormously successful career building houses, mostly in Sardinia during the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. This is in fact a project elsewhere in Italy, but I've always been particularly interested in the way that Ponis sees landscape and buildings as on a continuum, if you like. And again, he's working without reference to precise topographical data. If we could go on one more from there. Yeah, so this is him again. These are amongst the drawings that are most requested by students and visitors. This is a very early project for a path to lead from the yacht club on the right in Porto Rafael to the beach on the left. What's interesting here is that when he arrived in Sardinia in 1962, there was no survey information, no aerial photography, no coherent mapping, no surveyor who could make that, who could gather that information. And so what he does is develop his own language for expressing this very intense, you can see on the right, this is a photograph of one of the stages on the path, this very, very intense rocky landscape. And as he says himself, even if he'd had been able to make technical drawings, there was no contractor available on at that time in Sardinia who could have understood the drawings that he was making. And out of that challenge, he himself said that out of this challenge of trying to represent the landscape, he developed this when he went on to build houses, this architecture that was enormously responsive to place and circumstance. In the end, he built nearly 300 houses in Sardinia, almost entirely for very rich, very spoiled people, but it was still a major achievement. So that's Alberto Ponis. The next, please. Here is Alvaro Siza with another landscape strategy. This is 1977 for the Malagueira project, where famously on his first weekend on site, from which this sketchbook comes, he went in a small aeroplane and flew over the site. And he develops this language of aerial perspectives that is a way of integrating the new building with the existing landscape, which is incredibly complicated because it's was a very, very densely cultivated agricultural landscape adjacent to a very important medieval and Baroque city. And what you see here is at the top are the walls of the original city and the beginnings of the new development that he's imagining. And there are a couple more images of Caesar's drawing. So next, please. So this is simply very, very typical of his representation or his thinking and representational strategy. And then I think there's another one to follow this. Next. Yeah, and this is perhaps a better example where he's designing landscape elements within this huge development of 1,500 houses. And it's a sensibility towards landscape which I think is unique and extraordinary. Next, please. Yeah, and then finally, this is Peter Wilson before he moves to Germany and working on a scheme very much in the spirit of William Kent for a parkland landscape in Northern Ireland. And in a way, this is just a taste. The drawing on the right is actually part of a presentation series for the client, although it's actually very much presented as being in sketch form. The drawing on the left is his analysis of the site on the first day that he was there. And between these two come 80 or 90 drawings where he's examining details of the scheme and, above all, how these interventions, these architectural interventions, will sit in the landscape. And then finally, next, please. Now, are you able to play that, Roxana? Yes. So this, I thought, would make a good ending. This is a Leporello, a Japanese sketchbook, where Peter Wilson, who we were just talking about, drew in the 1990s his own very personal response to the Northern European industrial landscape. And it's actually a wonderful thing because you can both pull it out. So it's about 20 feet long, but you can either pull it out or you can flip the pages. But it's a response to what he had to confront when he moved from working in London to a much broader, flatter landscape. And it remains a fantastic document. Again, like the Ponis drawings, it's something that many people asked to see. That's it, really. I hope that was in some way coherent. I'm very happy to answer any questions that any of you might have.
That's all fantastic material, Niall. And really, the sequence of looking at each one and the challenges of representation that you spoke about is very important to know how persistent this challenge is and how different artists and creators navigate it. Among other many things that you mentioned, I would be happy to pass it on directly to our residents. They have just started working on the topic of the sublime. It's literally the second, or if not third day of
And I
their.
recognised, Rini, that this may be Rini, this might be rather a fast ball to have thrown at everybody at this point.
That's perfect. I think that's exactly what the residents need. And whether someone is working for the residency program or not, I think, having that information and visual stimulation is really, really important to get the thinking going and grapple with how to represent. I think all of our residents as of now are working with their hands, and they're sketching and producing and drawing in physical means. And so it's pretty impressive to see in just the third day what they were able to produce already. I think it would be interesting to hear from the residents, how they grapple with the means of representation with paper or whatever they're working with.
Yeah. No, I'd be very fascinated to hear that too, and also whether any of the things that we that I showed you struck some kind of chord with your own practice.
Hello, Niall. Thank you so much for such a great lecture and fantastic drawings.
Not a lecture, not a lecture.
Talk.
Only talk. Talk.
Sorry.
It's a talk.
I was particularly inspired by your chapter on the picturesque, the English picturesque. I noticed how you were talking about the sublimity being achieved through this sort of like perceptive extension of space, right? On a very limited parcel of England. I feel like there might be another element to the sublimity, which I feel is about time, the idea of like doubling time through the expression of ruins. In particular, I remember that you sort of like started with Giuliano Sangallo's and drawings, which had this sort of like, I don't know if fetishization is the right word to describe. I wonder if this, I don't know, fascination of ruin is in any way constructive in making space, let's say, for the architects of contemporary architects in this sort of like context.
I mean, do you? I mean, these figures in England in the 18th century were trying to reconstruct a Greek ideal landscape, a Greek classical ideal landscape. Do you see what would be the thing, Alex, that you would draw out of the Hudson Valley, or either draw out from it or impose upon it? I'm not sure. I'm not sure what the right description is. I mean, certainly this certainly you can't, and I think you're quite right to bring it up. Certainly you can't uh, discuss the picturesque or the sublime without addressing the question of time and nostalgia and memory. And I mean that's key to the whole thing, really.
Yeah, I was not really like thinking about the site in particular. I was very much curious on those, drawings.
Have you been to the site yet?
Oh, yeah, I haven't been to the site.
Yeah, okay, but you'll get there eventually.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
I have a comment and maybe a question. I think one thing that came up in our earlier discussions together is this idea of a juxtaposition of scales that's really important in exploring sublimity. I noticed that in a lot of the drawings that we looked at, there's a sort of idea of landscape as a field and architecture as either an object proposition or perhaps something that's continuous with that field. But I think that also what's important to the study of the sublime is an inverted, but thinking of a microcosmic experience, thinking of a tree or a rock or just the light of something so small. And have you also come across this kind of inversion in how an architect studies and draws a microcosmic experience?
Yes, to the extent that the sketchbooks that I described are loaded with tiny views of interiors or very, very constrained urban spaces or whatever. So that the as I said at the beginning, Shrey, these are it's all landscape, if you like, and architects take too much on themselves, and they should actually be thinking at every scale and in every spatial condition.
Yeah, I just want to add, I was most struck in the end, actually, kind of on this note, I was struck the last example you showed with Peter Wilson's Japanese sketchbook, where he was just studying what I was the starkness of the industrial landscape by drawing such a large scale section and then just one building. There's a sense of perceived absence or, in that representation. And I think maybe an idea of subtraction or loss, which is something that as contemporary architects, we begin to grapple with in industrial landscapes. And it's not about reading just a landscape as is, but actually and creating a rhetoric around why we should add to it, but also studying this idea of the absent. And I think in that example, it was the most apparent.
No, I think that's true. And actually, Peter says that the idea for doing the thing came to him from sitting endlessly on a train between Berlin and London, watching this flat landscape go by. But I agree with you that actually taking things away is an opportunity as well.
Hi, Niall. Thank you so much for the talk. All the sketches were beautiful. I think during your talk, I was really struck by when you said that representation is never innocent. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you were kind of referring to how there is always an intended and time or context connected to these drawings. And in thinking of the sublime, I think while there can be time associated with it, I think time is kind of something that's seen as very vast, whether that's like over from the past to like the future, which is relatively unknown. Um, but I guess in connection to what you said, I was wondering if the sublime is something that could be timeless or innocent in your own words. I don't know if you have any reflections on that.
What I think is that well, so many of the drawings I showed you were conceptual projects. And maybe that's the clue, that actually you should see your brief, the sublime brief, as a kind of liberation, and not feel constrained in any way by the uh, uh, certainly not too much by history, but actually maybe not so constrained by the need to actually get it built, or the expectation of actually getting it built. I don't know. I think the Sublime does allow that, uh, with the caveat that the kind of Sublime that Kant is talking about is actually pure nature. It's extremes of nature rather than man-made things. I see I see the kind of things by Desprez that I was showing you as an effort to kind of play catch up with a philosophical shift that had happened, that was happening contemporaneously. And that's why I was keen to make the point that the sublime occurs at a point at which the artists go back out into the landscape and start drawing it directly.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that like in my own drawings, that's something I'm trying to capture time, but it's definitely something that is hard to represent.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I think the fact that it's hard to represent shouldn't discourage you from trying, because I think it's incredibly important. I think very often we say that the the hardest problems of representation are the ones that produce the most interesting drawings, because of the tension that they have. That's in a way a little bit why I showed you the Louis Kahn, the terrible Louis Kahn drawing. Uh, uh, he, however bad it is as a drawing, there's a kind of energy there that is actually very palpable and affecting.
Yeah, that actually made me think of another question I had kind of written down before the conversation
Yeah.
About like curatorial bias or taste and whether or not that is something that you take into consideration when you're collecting these items. Like, I think that the conversation
I,
around like, preservation and why we choose to preserve specific articles is really interesting. And yeah, I was wondering if you might want to talk about that
um,
as well.
Claire, I'm delighted to talk about it. It's a very big topic.
Yeah.
And I make no apologies for curatorial subjectivity in relation to all the images that I showed you. In my own defense, I would say that when I talk to the team about what images might be relevant to the talk, because we approached it very much as we approach a workshop. We sort of assumed somebody had come to us and said, we'd like to do something on the Sublime with our students. They produced, gosh, 7 or 8 times as many images as I've shown you just now. So there was a huge editing process in there, and these choices that we've and even within the larger category, of course, there is an editorial process. It's informed as much as anything by a realization now, at all events, that uh, the are the institutions that we work a great deal with and to whom I'm very close, but who were formed to preserve large archival collections of architectural drawings, have actually allowed themselves to be, if you like, defeated by the very thing that they're there to preserve. So the our incredible advantage is that we can't have everything. And the most important curatorial skill that I exercise is actually saying no. Um, uh, and yes, yes, we have to make these judgments. I say yes, I say I say we, but we have to make these judgments all the time. My daughter always says to me that I go around the world talking to old architects who always want to give me the drawings that they did of a building they produced last year, and I want the drawings that they produced when they were 25 and their hair was down to their shoulders, and they never thought they were going to build anything, because those were the radical moments. But yes, it's a constant and fascinating process of sifting, and I'm sure we're not getting it right all the time.
Yeah, I
But
just said it was
and I'm sorry, and a final defense of the way I do it uh, is that to a huge extent the 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 response of our, which I mentioned at the beginning, the response of the people who come to consult and study the drawings informs the choices that we make.
mhm. Yeah,
Now, it might be in 100 years' time that they want to look at completely different things, and if the collection is still around, we won't have them. You know.
yeah, I was just going to add that I
Anyway,
thought
sorry,
it was interesting how you mentioned that even though the drawing in your mind was bad or um, maybe not perfect, it was still considered as something that was important to the topic um, to keep
uh,
as relevant.
yeah, I think that I mean it's worth saying that in my sort of earlier lives working with museums, um, I noticed something again and again, which was that these very, very sophisticated curators in the museums who knew far more than I did about what we were looking at always proudly showed me uh, uh, architectural drawings that I thought were pretty boring. Because they had this impulse to bring the finished building into the museum space, and they were much shrewder when it came to a preparatory drawing for a painting or a sculpture, uh, which had the kind of energy that I was interested in. And that's in a way what I'm saying about the Louis Kahn drawing is that it's precisely because he's struggling to get an idea onto paper that it becomes, in a way, an interesting and exciting drawing. Does that help at all?
Yes, yeah. Thank you very much.
Hi, Niall. So thanks for sharing that. I think that was really refreshing in a way that we can see so many layers involved in the drawing process. Like uh, otherwise, previously I would see drawings and I wouldn't be able to analyze it in a way that you kind of moved us through. And I think that was really important thing that I will take away with from this lecture. Um,
Well,
One important reflection that I would like to share was, there is this drawing which is used as to express an emotion or to use drawing as a tool to think. But then there's this thin line and kind of distinction between drawing used to represent or like the pragmatic details and the sensibility of a more functional form of used in the drawing. So I was kind of just struggling with this idea of using drawing as a way to express and
yeah.
drawing as a way to kind of represent something more sensitive.
Um, I think it's uh, I mean, as I think I mentioned, the question we always ask is, why did he or she make this drawing? Were they communicating with themselves in a very, very personal way? And as you say, expressing an emotional response, or were they sitting in a group with a community for whom they were designing a building? Were they sitting in a group with other people in the office to whom they were trying to communicate ideas and so on? So this is always the test. And it's a one can't always come up with the right answer, uh, but um, but I think if you're ever in London, you should come and spend a morning looking at very private sketchbooks, and you would see that many of these people have no difficulty at all in getting their emotions down on paper. Yeah.
Thanks, Matt.
Anybody else?
Maybe just a quick reflection as well, and if it leads into a question, we can chat. But I think, like many of the others, I was highly impacted by the sketchbooks that you showed, and how even in my own practice, sketching is the thing that is, or maintaining a sketchbook has been a continuous thread since I was probably 14 or 15 years old as a young artist. And now my most prized possessions are the sketchbooks that I carried with me in Rome for a summer 2 years ago. But there's like an honesty or a truthfulness to them because there was such a limited amount of time to create whatever, to capture whatever I was walking past or whatever I was drawing. And so when I'm looking at the sketchbooks that you presented today, do you ever think about maybe this idea of honesty or a revisitation into the drawings to kind of like capture a greater imagination? I'm also thinking of like what you were saying with the picturesque of the movement fully developed into what it could be because they began to sketch from observation. And so, do you ever think that any of those drawings were revisited to kind of capture the full extent of something that maybe wasn't there to begin with?
I mean, I think that, well, one of the things we've discovered is that every architect's practice in their sketchbooks is different and highly personal. And that's actually what makes it most rewarding. I've discovered over the years that different um, different architects value their sketchbook production in different ways. Some dismiss it as irrelevant to their design practice. Um, uh, Others regard it as, I mean, we have Alvaro Caesar's first 65 sketchbooks from his career. He When I explained to him that in getting all the material for these public housing projects in the 1970s, I had to have the sketchbooks as well. He was amazed that I wanted them. And it was a long negotiation, it has to be said. So there is this sense of people treating their sketchbooks very differently. There are other sketchbook sets that we have which are highly curated. So I don't think one can actually generalize. What is clear to me is that for most of these people, they become an important reference to which they can return often in developing ideas. And not only in sketchbooks, but it's just I thank God for the ones who develop a practice of using sketchbooks rather than just scraps of paper, because above all, one can understand the sequence of thought. And actually, what we often say when looking at sketchbooks with students is that the most interesting moment is the moment when they decide to turn the page. And it's not that the sheet that they're working on is finished, but that they're done with it. It's a very different thing, and that they need to start again. And this is a wonderful. It's a wonderful thing to observe with I'm thinking particularly of Adolfo Natalini sketchbooks and Caesar sketchbooks, Tony Fretton sketchbooks, and so on. I don't know if that's helpful at all.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate your answer.
Niall, thank you very much for this amazing
Not at all, Stephen. Very
with
nice
our
of you to
work.
come to it. Well, you can see that I hope you can see that I enjoyed myself putting it together.
No, I'm really very excited to visit Drawing Matter. I'm very excited. You know, last time we were there, we had dinner with Kenneth Frampton. So I'm hoping in the next few months, I'm now in Patrick's, Greece, that I'm hoping to get up there, and I hope to stop in and meet you in person. But
Well, that would
thank you
be,
very much for this great contribution to our little organization.
well, thank you all, and I'm sorry to have interrupted your holiday, Stephen.
No, I'm not. I'm working.
You're
I'm
working.
working in my
Okay, good.
sketchbook.
Okay, good. Okay, I expected nothing less. That's very nice. Then it will do come and
Every day,
every day. Ken is going to come and do a session in the archive, hopefully in September. So maybe it would coincide with a trip of yours. I think we may have lost the connection.
Great. Let me know.
Anyway,
Very good.
you're very welcome. It
Thank
was
you very much.
enjoyable. And
Bye-bye.
Rosanna, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you so much for showing us the wonderful collection of drawings, and thank you for joining us today.
Okay,
Bye.
fantastic.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye,
Bye.
everybody. Thank you.
Hawk.